So hello and welcome to the video, and welcome again to Terminal 2 at London's Heathrow. I'm flying again from Terminal 2 at London's Heathrow on ITA Airlines, the Phoenix airline of Alitalia, which bit the dust about a year ago. And I'm flying from here to Venice, or to Trieste more specifically, because we're boarding a cruise ship tomorrow from Venice, but they've told us to actually go to Trieste, a little bit like saying go to Southampton for a cruise, but the ship will actually be in Swansea. So we're flying from London down to Rome, connecting across to Trieste, travelling with my mum. We're going to be in business class, so if you'd like to see what the experience is like...
Ah, look at my happy face. So enthusiastic, so optimistic, and about to be so disappointed. To find out why, as I say here,
stick around!
Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So subscribe to the channel so you can come with me.
Right, as we stroll into Heathrow's Terminal 2, a bit of a history lesson. Italy's national airline had been Alitalia since 1946, but the airline struggled for profitability in the 20th century, despite Etihad reportedly investing $2 billion into the airline in 2014, taking a 49% stake. In 2017, just 3 years later, Etihad gave up and walked away from their investment, resulting in the company entering administration, which gives an indication of how rubbish Alitalia used to be if they can chew through $2 billion in 3 years. Several airlines took a close look at buying the company out of administration, but no one could make a deal work, and when the pandemic descended in 2020, the Italian government took back control of the airline. They wanted to spin the assets into a new company, but European law prevented them from using the Alitalia name, which I think it's fair to say annoyed the Italian government. So a new entity was formed, Italia Trasporto Aereo SPA, forgive the pronunciation, which bought the assets of the old group, including the Alitalia name, even though they couldn't use it, which is why I called it ITA in the intro, even though people seem to refer to it as ITA, as in Italia. Now the company is restructured, it is much more attractive to investors, so talks are ongoing about a privatisation, and they are trying to find a way of returning the Alitalia branding under ITA ownership. So the ITA/ITA name hasn't been around for long, and it may not be around for long. But under that branding, it has taken Alitalia's slots at Heathrow and its slot in the SkyTeam alliance. So the check-in at the business class counter was quick and efficient, just proof of vaccination required for entry to Italy at time of recording. Then the first clue that all was not well. Italian regulations require that a specific type of face mask be worn on all Italian public transport, including airlines. So we were ordered to find a pharmacy airside and buy FFP2 masks for the flight. We'd assumed they'd be provided to premium class travellers, not an unreasonable assumption I think, given we'd paid over £600 each for the return flights, but nope, we needed to go out of our way to drop £12 on a pack of 5 masks at WH Smith's. Not an auspicious start. We used the Gold Track security as business class passengers, which for once was quicker than the regular lane. Terminal 4 was SkyTeam's terminal before the pandemic, with a decent SkyTeam branded lounge available to Alitalia's customers. T4 remains closed though, so ITA uses the Plaza Premium Lounge in T2. This is a contract lounge. My expectations were quite low. It was actually a pretty nice space to spend an hour. A bit dark, a fairly narrow drinks range and not a huge food offering, although what they did have on offer was very tasty. That hour passed very pleasantly. To the plane, and ITA uses the A gates, which avoids the long walk to the B gates. Terminal 2 is a very compact terminal to transit if you depart from an A gate. Wear your walking shoes though if you depart a B gate. I got a glimpse of the plane and saw that it was yet to visit the paint shop to take on ITA's distinctive blue livery. I wouldn't be shocked to hear that repainting is being delayed in case management find a way of reinstating the Alitalia branding. We timed it well, so went straight through the boarding formalities onto the plane, an Airbus A320, and I think this sums up the odd relationship between the two brands quite well. The business cabin has the now standard economy style seating with the middle seat blocked off. It looks like Alitalia had decided to offer 32 inches of legroom for the first 8 rows, regardless of whether that row ended up being in business or economy. Worth knowing if travelling economy, as the seats behind row 8 have 30 inches of pitch. We had to evict some seat squatters from our seats in the bulkhead row before we could settle in. That's what an FFP2 mask looks like, by the way. 5 rows in business class today, which ended up around 70% full. We had a little more than 32 inches of legroom in the front row, although there's nowhere to stick your feet. Overall though, it was a very comfortable seat. A convenient coat hook too, should you need it. Alitalia branding still on the bulkhead, although the inner triangle seemed to have fallen off and not been replaced. The arm of my mum's seat was also held together with masking tape. Otherwise there were overhead air vents and lights, but no in-seat power, and although there seemed to be an in-flight entertainment system in the seat arms, it wasn't working. I didn't even look to see if there was Wi-Fi, as there was no advertising for it, and if business class passengers have to buy their own masks, there's no way the airline was going to pay to install a Wi-Fi system. A pre-departure beverage was offered, only orange juice or water though, although that was better than nothing, I suppose. So we took off towards the west, a late afternoon departure into a very pleasant London sky. When ITA launched, it aggressively offered status matches so as to build a frequent flyer base. I sent info of my BA Gold status across and was very quickly accepted for that match, so travelled as a Gold member of their scheme. That status was not recognised at any stage of the 4 flights I took. I travelled in business class, so the opportunities for recognition were probably limited, and other airlines are patchy at recognising their high-tier frequent flyers, but it's probably a point worth mentioning. We crossed the English coast just east of Brighton and got a spectacular view of the Isle of Wight. About 20 minutes after takeoff, the in-flight service began. No menus were offered. Taking everything into account, I conclude that this was a cost-saving measure rather than a consequence of the you-know-what. Or perhaps there was no menu, as ITA is embarrassed by what they offered. First was a drinks round. My mum requested a gin and tonic. Sorry, no gin. Would you like a Prosecco? So we had a Prosecco each and the crew moved on before I could fully identify what they did have. I later found that there was only beer and wine available, which again is not great, and I took it to be another indicator of financial stress for the airline. You can't quite make it out here, but one of the allergens for the rosemary biscuit tortellini snacks was fish, which I thought was a little odd for a rosemary biscuit tortellini snack. Perhaps 10 minutes later, dinner arrived. A tray was offered by the crew without any discussion of choice. I asked what it was and was told lasagna. A moment later, after a conference between the crew, that answer was revised to ravioli. I thought it a bit odd that no choice was offered, particularly as vegetarians may not have declared their dietary preferences through ITA's system before boarding, but it turned out that this was a vegetarian ravioli, with a salad, bread and a chocolatey pudding, accompanied by a glass of unidentified red wine. Now it was all really nice, even if the bread was a bit dry, but just offering one vegetarian option to everyone in business class can only be a cost-saving measure. Refills were offered with a chocolatey covered nutty nougat sweet. There's probably a name for it, which you are welcome to share in the comments. And while you're down there, give me a like and please consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. I'll show some pretty footage of the Alps while you do so. Loo review time. The FFP2 masks are looser fitting around the face than the regular surgical masks and aren't that uncomfortable to wear if I'm honest. It's a loo. One moderate maintenance issue, but at least it was clean. Flight time was a little over 2 hours, and as we crossed the Italian coast, the crew cleared our glassware but left all the rubbish. They also missed a glass across the aisle. And we landed into Rome Airport. It is vanishingly unlikely that an empty snack packet is going to fly around the cabin and injure someone if there was an incident, but loose glassware might. But it's the crew's job to address even vanishingly small risks, so the rubbish should have been cleared, not least because it gives an extremely shoddy impression if it isn't. All the trash was in full view, and all the passengers I could see around us were also surrounded by their accumulated rubbish, so I can only assume that this was down to crew apathy. Throughout the flight they'd been pleasant, but it wasn't an overwhelming experience. Any sympathy I may have had from the crew, who must also be frustrated by how the last few years have panned out, evaporated when they just couldn't be bothered to clear the cabin. So off the plane and into the terminal where masks weren't required. We had a 60-minute connection to our onward flight to Trieste and were mildly alarmed to encounter an ITA employee holding a Trieste sign. It turns out that a new area of Rome's airport had opened that very day, which greatly increased the distance you needed to cover to reach the gate. She'd been deputised to facilitate the transfer. We arrived into the E gates and were departing from the A gates, which from studying the terminal on Google Maps, I reckon was a 1.4 kilometre walk, which is about 0.9 of a mile. Plus there's a passport check in the middle, as Rome was our point of entry into the Schengen zone. It took us perhaps 10 minutes to wait for the third transferring passenger to disembark. Let's say we'd need 10 minutes for the passport queue, and we need to arrive at the gate at least 15 minutes before the departure time. So the 60-minute connection only allowed for 25 minutes of walking, in which time we needed to cover a mile. My mum is mobile, but she isn't rapid over the ground, and this was an equation that wasn't going to work. We passed a group of 5 airport staff who had 3 electric buggies between them, and the ITA agent pleaded with them to help us, but they refused. Presumably because they'd not received a correctly authorised work order in triplicate 72 hours in advance, so wouldn't raise a finger to assist an elderly passenger who was clearly struggling. In the end, I commandeered a wheelchair we found and shoved my mother through the airport myself. I obviously didn't film this bit as my hands were full. We needed to be expedited through a lengthy passport queue, and we made it, but we would not have done so had I not taken the decision to basically steal a wheelchair. It was an absolutely ridiculous expectation to set for fit and healthy passengers, let alone older passengers who aren't as sprightly on their pins as they once were. I wasn't going to film the return journey, but after this experience we felt we had no option but to request disabled assistance for the return connection. We had 2 hours on the way back, but it was still a challenging distance for Mum to cover, even with the ability to take our time. And receiving disabled assistance through Fiumicino Airport was an experience, let me tell you. So look out for a comical video about our return journey in a couple of weeks. The Trieste flight departed from a remote stand, so we took a bus from the terminal, then we went up the stairs into another unrepainted plane, an Airbus A319 this time, for the 1 hour flight to Trieste. 3 rows of business this time, but to be honest, I was a bit over the whole thing at this point, so didn't film much of the flight. The attendant on this flight though was excellent, and he could see that we were a bit stressed, so very quickly got some Prosecco into our hands. It was a little frisky when opened, but it did hit the spot. Enjoyed alongside some more rosemary biscuit tortellini fish snacks that were actually quite Moorish. So off to the plane into Trieste Airport. A domestic arrival, so we were quickly through. So to sum up ITA Airlines, they're a bit rubbish really. Abundant, obvious cost-saving measures don't support the business class expectations set, yet they still charge a business class fare. They're Alitalia planes with Alitalia uniforms and Alitalia service carts, but operated as ITA. They clearly still love the Alitalia brand and want to resurrect it as soon as they can. But remember, Alitalia is a business that guzzled $2 billion of Etihad's cash in just 3 years, leaving Etihad zero value for their investment. I am occasionally accused of moaning too much in my reviews, but on this occasion I hope you can see how poor the offering was and can understand why I have to advise you to avoid ITA. The experience on the return flight was very similar, so the bland experiences I've shown here were not a one-off. And although the issues at Fiumicino Airport was not ITA's fault, it is a very poorly designed airport that I must also advise you to avoid, particularly if you are transiting into or out of the Schengen area. You've already liked, commented and subscribed, so all that's left to say is that I have a Patreon page through which you can support me more directly if you like what I am doing here. It's linked in the description below. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.